from 1869 to 1872. He represented the district on the Otago Provincial Council as well from 1872 to 75, and he also spent one term as a member of the House of Representatives. Then, late in 1873, Hallensteins founded the New Zealand Clothing Factory. And following on from that, Bendix opened their first retail store on the corner of the Octagon in 1876. Opened a bigger factory in 1883, and this is the bigger factory you can see here, as the company really started to flourish. He established the DIC in 1884, and so on. And you can find that all that story summarised in a timeline that's on the back of the trail brochure. Now, nearly a decade after Bendix's death, he was described in the Evening Star newspaper as one of the most enterprising, far-seeing and philanthropic citizens that Dunedin has ever possessed. So, some of his acts of philanthropy related to the welfare of his workers. He was supportive of the trade union movement and the efforts to stamp out sweating. He established a relief fund that provided a doctor and medicines and grants to his factory workers if they were experiencing hard times. For a while he was a committee member of the Jewish Philanthropic Society, which provided similar relief for members of the Jewish community. And so when he passed away, in his will he bequeathed £250, that would be over $50,000 in today's money, to the New Zealand Clothing Factory Relief Fund, and another £250 to the synagogue. But he left twice as much, £500, that's nearly $110,000 today, to the Dunedin Hospital trustees. And so that went a long way to helping them build a new extension to the hospital. So he was indeed quite philanthropic. You also see his name popping up in association with providing relief in the wake of disasters. So both here and overseas, he gave donations, he served on committees that were set up to provide relief for victims of floods in particular, but other disasters as well. So this photo is the Queenstown store during some flooding in the mid-1860s. He also supported the city's cultural institutions. He gifted the Egyptian mummy to Toitū Otago Museum in 1894. You're probably aware that that's how the mummy came to be at Otago Museum. And in terms of the Settlers Association, in 1904, when the early Settlers Association, as it was then, started planning to build the museum, he gave £50 and a letter of support to kickstart the campaign. Unfortunately, he didn't get to see the museum open in 1908 because he passed away in 1905. So today, you'll find his portrait up on the wall of the Smith Gallery. So there it is, down in that bottom row there, and a supporting biography all about him. The museum would later benefit from the support of his descendants too. So when Ted Friedlander retired as head of Hallensteins in 1989, he donated a number of photographs and pieces of company memorabilia to the museum, including the iconic figures that you're all waiting to hear about. So the Hallenstein connection to Toitū is quite a long-standing one. And it just so happened that we were refreshing the displays in the area of the museum that we call First Great City. to include a new iteration of the Hallenstein story when we were asked to become involved in the citywide activation. So that became our contribution to the citywide activation project. Now, while I was researching the display, which was done with the help of the Settlers Association History Prize intern a couple of years ago, I found several mentions in the personal columns of newspapers about employees from the factory getting married. So I found 34 notices for staff getting married between 1887 and 1899, so the end of the First Great City period. And so they mentioned the names of 38 staff getting married, 33 brides-to-be and 5 grooms. That's because there were a lot of women that worked in the factory. And in this particular example, both the bride and the groom were employed in the factory. So it's been great to be able to find out a little bit more about some of these people now that we've got their names, and find out what their life story is. And in this particular case, the groom went on to become quite well known. He was actually mayor of Roslyn at one point. And then I came across another story relating to Hallensteins that I want to tell you about. And this story starts in 1888. It was Saturday the 16th of June, to be precise. And it was a miserable night, and it had been raining. A chap named Alfred Hogg was passing by the Hallensteins' house on the corner of London and Victoria Streets. So I think this is up in this corner up here. And he heard a noise. And he went to investigate, and in a sheltered spot in the Hallensteins' garden, he discovered a baby girl wrapped in a brown shawl with a bottle by its side and a note. And the note said, "Take me in and use me well, for therein I have not home to dwell." So he scooped the baby up, and he went and knocked on Hallenstein's door, and he handed her over into the care of Mary Hallenstein. The next day, Mary passed the child over to the appropriate authorities, while the police attempted to trace the mother. They had no luck. But then many months later, February 1889, out of the blue, a woman approached a police constable claiming that the child was hers. She was arrested and charged with child abandonment. So her name was Emma Brookland, also known as Emma Brooklyn and Emma Brookfield. So who was she? And how had her baby ended up in the Hallenstein's garden? Well, she was a middle-aged widow. Her husband, Peter Brookland, had been killed in June 1886. He'd been struck on the back of the neck by a falling branch when he was employed to clear bush for a railway line down in Southland. He was then aged 40, and supposedly he'd left Emma with 12 children to look after. A considerable sum of money was raised for the now fatherless family's upkeep, and that was administered by a charitable aid board, but Emma and the board had a bit of a falling out, and her children were taken off her. And then in 1887 she got pregnant again. And in 1888 she moved in with the Jarrett family in Philil Street, where she gave birth to the child. 2 weeks after the birth, the baby was advertised for adoption. One woman said she'd take it in 2 weeks' time, but then she never showed up. Mrs. Jarrett allegedly then suggested she could make Emma Brooklyn's problem disappear. And she had her daughter put the baby, who was then 5 weeks old, a couple of blocks away in the Hallenstein's garden. And the Jarretts then fled the country, and Emma Brooklyn moved to Christchurch. So about a month after she returned to Dunedin and was charged with abandoning the child, a grand jury was set up to try and figure out what to do with it. And so their decision sort of rested on the argument that if she knew the child had been endangered by being left exposed in the garden, and she failed to go and rescue it, then she was guilty. But if she believed the child had been deposited in the garden and that was a safe place and all was going to be well, she had no case to answer. And that's what the grand jury decided. So she was discharged. I'm not sure where she went to next, but we do know what happened to the baby. So the child was placed in the care of a Mrs. Harvey, and her upkeep was paid for by the benevolent trustees. But after 3 months, the trustees pulled their funding, and the baby was handed over to the industrial school instead, and placed in the care of another woman. But then a few weeks later, health took a turn for the worse, and she died. 7th of November, about 5 months after being found in the garden. Now, the baby didn't have a name, so the head of the industrial school suggested she be called Rose Garden. And so I went to the DCC cemetery database, and sure enough, there is a Rose Garden. And so after finding that out, I decided to go and try and find the grave. And this is it, the Northern Cemetery. So this is her grave nearest to the camera. She's not mentioned on the grave's headstone. That's for a burial of a 22-year-old sailor who was buried in the same plot 2 years later. But as you can see, there is a rose garden of sorts marking the grave of Rose Garden. Okay. So another thing we did some research on while we were working on the new display was this advertising automaton. And so Fiona's going to talk you through a bit more about the preparation for that figure in a minute. But first I just wanted to run through what I found out about the history of these sort of things in Dunedin. So automata like this were quite popular in Victorian times. And here in Dunedin we begin to see them being used in theatre acts from the 1860s onwards. Although sometimes they were just fakery, trickery, rather than proper automatons. So in 1866, there was a juggling automaton made an appearance at a concert in Port Chalmers. Another touring performer bought a mechanical automatic slack rope vaulter to Dunedin in 1873. So one of the more famous automatons of its day was one called Psycho, which was a whist-playing Indian figure that was first shown off in London in 1875, and various copies were made of Psycho, and a couple of those came to Dunedin. So one in 1880 and another one in 1882, although the latter one was exposed as a fraud. In 1887, we got an electrical figure known as Ali, which had been developed in England, became the latest automaton to be shown off here. Operated 6 times daily opposite the Queen's Theatre in Princes Street. So Ali would read the Quran, engaged in sword play, wrote on a glass tablet, played the tambourine and other musical instruments. And then we start to see them being used for advertising in shops as well. So in May 1886, the largest automaton figure in the colony could be seen working at the Indian Tea Depot in Princes Street. And then a mechanical figure of an old woman knitting appeared in the shop window at Brown Ewing and Co. In 1892, just before Christmas. And then in 1893, she was replaced with a man playing a banjo who would also move his legs and his head about. And occasionally stuck out his tongue too. So, some of you may remember some of these automatons in your own lifetime. Humpty here, which came from Brown Ewing, I think. So that's all I've got to tell you. Time to hand over to Fiona.
All right, lovely. Okay, great. Thank you, Peach. Like I said, very hard act to follow, because I don't have psychos, as I say. So good morning, everyone. My name is Fiona McLaughlan, and I'm a member of the collections team here at Toitū. My part of the talk this morning will be about the research and conservation of the Hallenstein automatons selected by Pete to go on display in the first grade city gallery here at Toitū. So I thought before I start, some of you may not know what a conservator does, and that's my role here at the museum. So I recently found this quote in an article I have been reading, and I think it sums it up quite succinctly. So, it is a position of both privilege and power to be one of a select few who are permitted to touch and examine cultural heritage materials and have the agency to physically or digitally intervene to repair, conserve and extract information from an object. So obviously with such responsibilities there has to be some checks and balances, and they're a code of ethics. So all heritage professionals working in a museum are governed by a code of ethics. Internationally there is ICOM, the International Council of Museums. Nationally there is Museums Aotearoa Code of Ethics, and additionally for me as a conservator there are the NZCCM, the New Zealand Conservators of Cultural Materials Code of Ethics. So I'm quickly touching on these now because they'll pop up later on in the presentation. So although the automaton has been in the collection, as Pete said, since 1989, my first interaction with it came about due to public inquiry back in 2016. Their interest was in automata, and finding out that we had one in the collection, they contacted the registrar to make an appointment to come and view the object. Access to the interior of the automaton was limited, so they brought with them a mini endoscope, which is like a mini flexible hose with a camera on the end, and we tried to use it to investigate the interior of the torso. So, the endoscope camera was linked up to a computer and video was recorded. Hopefully that will play. Yeah. The access was through a small aperture in the base, and we're coming up now through the base, and it requires a certain amount of dexterity to manipulate the camera effectively. So it's a bit gloomy in there as well. You can see some screw heads there and some internal workings and a bit of the structure, but it wasn't that great. However, there were some tantalising glimpses, and this is a screenshot of German language newspapers used as papier-mâché to make the torso. So that was quite fun, but it was very frustrating as well that we couldn't get more information, apart from those quite poor videos. However, at this time, due to other priorities, the automaton went back into storage and the research was put on hold. So, fast forward to 2023, and Pete selects the automaton for display in the Hallenstein Legacy exhibition. I thought this was too good an opportunity to miss, not to pick up on the research that we started in 2016. So I contacted the original person who did the inquiry in 2016, and they were thrilled that we were looking at the automaton again. So, what did we want to know? What were our questions, and how could we answer our questions? I think the main one we wanted to know is who made the automata and where it was made. And then, was he originally a Hallenstein's automata? Had he been repurposed? And was he electrical at one point? Because now he's he's a wind-up mechanism. He's got a spring clock mechanism in there. So, and what happened to his hair? He got very bald. So, and I know he did have hair at one point too. So my talk is called Following the Breadcrumbs, a Collaborative Approach, because that's what I had to do in order to try and answer some of my questions. So my first port of call was the registrar, and she provided me with the original donation documentation. Again, as Pete said, in 1989, a donation of 264 items was made to the museum, a mix of objects and archival material. I don't know if is there a pointer? Yeah. And if you see here, this is our automaton number 113. And as you can see, there are 264 items all in total. Unfortunately, it does not appear that a history of the items was taken from the donor at the time of the donation to give more of a background story to some of the items, but I'm hoping that this may come to light in the future. As you'll see in the list, there's also a number of photographs up here. And so I decided to go and look at those next, and in order to do that I had to go and see our archivist who got them out of store for me. So a number of the photographs were interiors of the shop, and I was quite hopeful that we would find our man lurking in the background of one of these photos. But what I didn't find him, but what I did find was this chap here, who you may recognise as this chap here. There's no guarantee that they're the same, because I think they're probably mass-produced objects, but I thought it was quite nice that I found one of them. He is a bellboy figurine in Hallenstein's livery, carrying a case advertising New Zealand clothing HB Ultimax suits. And as Pete said, he's also on display in the First Great City Gallery. However, our automaton remained elusive. So, drawing a blank of the documentation held in the museum, I looked at external resources to try and find out any information. Unfortunately, I had, again, very limited success. Museums or private collectors tend to collect the more fancy, sword juggling and alcohol drinking and tongue poking automata rather than the more utilitarian ones like we have for advertisements. The one thing I did find out about him, though, that his hat is definitely not original. It was made from a 1970s hand-painted shop advert. So that was one thing I was searching about. We also made contact with external experts to see if they could identify the type of wood used to construct the automaton, and whether it had been modified. And as you can see, they're sure it was European wood that was used, not New Zealand. And our automaton expert was quite certain that it was designed for electrical operation, which would make sense really, because if it was on display, you wouldn't have to want to keep winding up every 10 minutes, and that's how long the run cycle was of the mechanism. So at this point, we have very limited paper-based information about the figure, and the external opinion was that it was European and that it had been electrical. So the next step was to investigate if the physical object itself could answer any of our questions. And using the NZCCM Code of Ethics, I put forward a proposal to the curator, Pete, and our collections manager, to undress the automaton and see what that revealed. As you can see in the first image, his clothing is really a case of smoke and mirrors. They were attached to each other and the automaton with tacking stitches, sellotape and pins. And there's a nail there at some point as well, which I didn't take a photograph of. So I clipped the stitching, I removed the sellotape and removed his clothing. And excitingly, during this exercise, I discovered that the collar and the clip for the bow tie were probably originals. And beneath the red bow tie, which is this one here, was a blue silk bow tie. And I'm kind of guessing that it was the original bow tie as well. That's the hat made out of the shop advert and a cummerbund. And his shirt sleeves were too short. The waistcoat was okay, but his shirt front was very dirty. So in this image, we can see potentially an original shirt sleeve. It was quite securely attached to the automata at the top, and it had been scrunched up and pushed into the sleeve of the shirt that replaced it. It was quite dirty and stained, but it had quite nice stitching along the hems here. And underneath is it's like a upholstery type stuffing, and that had been wrapped around the wire armature for the hand. Yeah. Of course, removing his clothing, it gave us an opportunity to see the pressed torso. So these were being mass manufactured into a mould. Again, the sellotape and these tabs that you can see here. And this is the first opportunity we had to look at the mechanism on his arm. It was quite a simple mechanism. The top rod, and then you've got a hinged elbow, and then you have a spring, and the spring expands and contracts, and that moves his arm up and down. It's quite a simple operation. Once I had removed his clothes, it was evident that he had been disassembled in the past. Bit of giveaway. Yes. So carrying out some tests, I was able to reactivate the adhesive that had been used, and I could pull those tabs back. I didn't have to remove them completely. Conservation treatments, they have to be documented. So in this one here, I've written a peeling back order, so to speak, and then I know how to peel them back and put them back in place. And when I was showing this video to somebody else, this picture, they said, "Oh, did you write directly on the object?" And I was like, no, this is a photo of it, and I wrote on the photo, so that's okay. You don't write directly onto things here. So here we are. His back is off. We now can see the mechanism for the first time. Before we were putting the endoscope up here into the cavity, and now we can see it. And on here, that's those German newspapers that we caught a glimpse of in 2016. So that was very exciting. So again, adopting a collaborative approach, I tapped into the linguistic skills of two colleagues here, and they were able to translate and subsequently geographically cite the newspaper clippings. So we've got an example here of one of the sections of the newspaper with the German and English translations, and they appear to be classified for seamstresses, tailoring, and rooms to rent. We also think they're the turn of the century as well. We need to do a little bit more research on the font used, so that's an ongoing project. Through their work, they identified the towns of Sonneberg, Neustadt, and Coburg, and these are all roughly 400 kilometers southwest of Berlin. I'm hoping these work. These are videos, so fingers crossed. As I mentioned earlier, documentation is very important. And rather than playing the automata over and over again, I liaised with our AV technician to film the interior, to make a record of how the cans and mechanisms work, and then these are added to the object record on our database. There we go. So that little pin on there stops the flywheel going round, so that's like a start-stop. And then we're panning up. And like I said, it's a fairly simple mechanism. So this rod here turns his head, and that little string you can see there next to it, that's being moved here, moves his eyes, open and closed. And then this mechanism here moves up and down, and that moves the elbow and the spring on this side. Like I say, he's a bit rough guts in there. He's got screws and just bits of glue and tapes and all sorts in there. He's not the most elegant of automata. And then hopefully there should be another video. Yep. And in this one we're going to see his arm moving, which is really neat. Of course, you can't see any of that when his clothes are on, so it's quite nice to see it there. Snickering from the back. And the movements are actually quite subtle, so you see his head turns, and then his eyes open and close. And I mentioned a bit earlier as well about his hair. That was leather, and it would have had some kind of hair attached to it, and the hair's all gone. But what I need to do, you can tell the leather from the follicle pattern, so that's something else we need to do as well. Yep, so now we had the images and video of the interior, it was time to redress him. So the decision was taken to remake some of the clothing and the hat, and we would keep the original in the stores. A new hat was made from our carbon materials by a paper conservator. I enlisted the help of one of our long-time textile volunteers to remake the shirt front and sleeves, and I remade the bow tie using blue silk to mimic the original. I also covered the torso with stockinette to protect the torso, but to also use as a substrate to attach the clothing to rather than sellotaping and pinning it onto the automata. I don't want to do that again. So here he is, in his new outfit, looking very dashing. I don't think he has a bad side. I think he looks quite good from both sides. I think I'm really pleased with how the sleeves worked, because if we look in the next image, so this is before and after. The changes have been quite subtle, so we changed his hat. I didn't do any work on his face at this time. We reinstated the bow tie, and if you can see here, because the sleeves were too short, you could actually see the mechanism, and I think that kind of spoilt the illusion a little bit about how he worked. So on this one, we made the sleeve a lot longer, and that kind of hides the mechanism quite well when the arm goes up and down. And then I did a bit of surface cleaning on the sign underneath, and then at the back, where you can see the cams working, I popped a little bit of card in there just to protect it from dust. So, did I get any answers to my questions? Well, always it's yes and no, isn't it really? What happened? Oh well, you'll never know. There we go. Let's see if I can find it. Casting onto my... Yeah. How do you start it from that slide, Pete?
Up to slideshow.
Yep.
What's the slideshow?
Oh, yeah.
From current slide.
Current slide. All right. Excellent. I shouldn't grip onto this so hard. I think that was the problem. Right. Here we go. I'll put that down. So kind of yes and no. We still don't know why this one survived. So like I said, hopefully one day we'll come across something similar, or we can find some more provenance details in the archive. We still don't know who made him. Obviously, the torso was made in Germany. There was no maker's mark inside, and I'm wondering perhaps if, potentially the head could be made one place, the hands could be made somewhere else, the torso could be made in Germany, and then they're all put together in a factory somewhere else. So we kind of need to do a bit more research into that. Yes, there were more clues inside. I still don't know what happened to his hair. I'm definitely going to find that out. Where are his clothes original? And that's quite nice that we discovered that the collar and his bow tie clip and his bow tie were potentially original things. And yes, he was electrical. So that's where we are at this point in time. Again, unfortunately, with other priorities, we're going to have to shelve this research project. But I'm still in contact with the person who had the original inquiry in 2016, and we're hoping to work together in the future to find out exactly where he came from. But she's subsequently moved to Australia, so we're going to have to do that sort of electronically. So thank you very much. Thank you for persevering with the technical difficulties.
Now, has anyone got any questions? I've got one to start off. Why did that original person come and ask about that automaton? What was the background, the reason?
So that's their area of interest. That's their hobby. They do research. She actually worked as an administrator, but her hobby is actually automaton and collecting them. She had quite a mechanical bent, so she was very interested in how they worked, like the engineering behind them as well. So yeah, so she goes around to all different places to look at the automata. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Any other questions for Fiona or Pete? Looks like you've covered it all very well. I didn't know that automaton moved. It would be lovely if you gave a wee demo one day.
Yes. I do think there is a video. Sorry, it's just turned up. I do think there is a video of him moving fully clothed in his new outfit. I couldn't find it at this time. So yes, it might be nice to.
That'd be lovely, even if you put it down by the automaton. It'd be lovely to see how it moved. But I know that was fascinating. So can you all please join me in thanking them very much?